The home at Steventon must have been for many years a pleasant and prosperous one. The family was unbroken by death and seldom visited by sorrow. Their situation had some peculiar advantages beyond those of ordinary rectories. Steventon was a family living. Mr. Knight, the patron, was also proprietor of nearly the whole parish. He never resided there, and consequently the rector and his children came to be regarded in the neighbourhood as kind of representatives of the family. They shared with the principal tenant the command of an excellent manner, and enjoyed in this reflected way some of the consideration usually awarded to landed proprietors. They were not rich, but, aided by Mr. Austen's powers of teaching, they had enough to afford a good education to their sons and daughters, to mix in the best society of the neighbourhood, and to exercise a liberal hospitality to their own relations and friends. A carriage and a pair of horses were kept. This might imply a higher style of living in our days than it did in theirs. There were then no assessed taxes. The carriage, once bought, entailed little further expense, and the horses, probably like Mr. Bennet's, were often employed on farm work. Moreover, it should be remembered that a pair of horses in those days was almost necessary if ladies were to move about at all, for neither the condition of the roads nor the style of the carriage building admitted of any comfortable vehicle being drawn by a single horse. When one looks at the few specimens still remaining of coach building in the last century, it strikes one that the chief object of the builders must have been to combine the greatest possible weight with the least amount of accommodation. The family lived in close intimacy with two cousins, Edward and Jane Cooper, the children of Mrs. Austen's eldest sister and Dr. Cooper, the vicar of Sunning, near Reading. The Coopers lived for some years at Bath, which seems to have been much frequented in those days by clergymen retiring from work. I believe that Cassandra and Jane sometimes visited them there, and that Jane thus acquired the intimate knowledge of the topography and customs of Bath, which enabled her to write Northanger Abbey long before she resided there herself. After the death of their own parents, the two young Coopers paid long visits at Steventon. Edward Cooper did not live undistinguished. When an undergraduate at Oxford, he gained the prize for Latin hexameters on Hortus Anglicus in 1791, and in later life he was known by a work on prophecy called The Crisis and other religious publications, especially for several volumes of sermons, which preached in many pulpits in my youth. Jane Cooper was married from her uncle's house at Steventon to Captain, afterwards Sir Thomas Williams, under whom Charles Austen served in several ships. She was a dear friend of her namesake, but was fated to become a cause of great sorrow to her. For a few years after the marriage, she was suddenly killed by an accident to her carriage. There was another cousin closely associated with them at Steventon, who must have introduced greater variety into the family circle. This was the daughter of Mr. Austen's only sister, Mrs. Hancock. This cousin had been educated in Paris, and she married a Count de Thurlade, of whom I know little more than that he perished by the guillotine during the French Revolution. Perhaps his chief offence was his rank, but it was said that the charge of incivism under which he suffered rested on the fact of his having laid down some arable land into pasture, a sure sign of his intention to embarrass the Republican government by producing a famine. His wife escaped through dangers and difficulties to England, and was received for some time into her uncle's family, and finally married her cousin Henry Austen. During the short peace of Amiens, she and her second husband went to France in the hope of recovering some of the Count's property, and there narrowly escaped being included amongst the détenus. Orders had been given by Bonaparte's government to detain all English travellers, but at the post houses, Mrs. Henry Austen gave the necessary orders herself, and her French was so perfect that she passed everywhere for a native, and her husband escaped under this protection. She was a clever woman and highly accomplished, after the French rather than the English mode, and in those days when intercourse with the continent was long interrupted by war, such an element in society of a country parsonage must have been a rare acquisition. The sisters may have been more indebted to this cousin than to Mrs. Latournelle's teaching for the considerable knowledge of French which they possessed. She also took the principal parts in the private theatricals in which the family several times indulged, having their summer theatre in the barn, and their winter one within the narrow limits of the dining room, where the number of the audience must have been very limited. On these occasions the prologues and epilogues were written by Jane's eldest brother, and some of them are very vigorous and amusing. Jane was only 12 years old at the time of the earliest of these representations, and not more than 15 when the last took place. She was, however, an early observer, and it may be reasonably supposed that some of the incidents and feelings which are so vividly painted in Mansfield Park theatricals are due to her recollections of these entertainments. Some time before they left Steventon, one great affliction came upon the family. Cassandra was engaged to be married to a young clergyman. He had not sufficient private fortune to permit an immediate union, but the engagement was not likely to be a hopeless or protracted one, for he had a prospect of early preferment from a nobleman with whom he was connected both by birth and by personal friendship. He accompanied this friend to the West Indies as chaplain to his regiment, and there died of yellow fever, to the great concern of his friend and patron, who afterwards declared that, if he had known of the engagement, he would not have permitted him to go out to such a climate. This little domestic tragedy caused great and lasting grief to the principal sufferer, and could not but cast a gloom over the whole party. The sympathy of Jane was probably from her age and her peculiar attachment to her sister, the deepest of all.